Jessica H. Schexnayder and Mary H. Manhein are the authors of Fragile Grounds, Louisiana's Endangered Cemeteries. They will be sharing their work on the environmental threats to South Louisiana's various sites. And a little background on each of them. Jessica is a Louisiana native and passionate about documenting the people, history, and culture of the southern part of the state. Her writing and photography have been featured in Louisiana Cultural Vistas, Country Roads magazine, Heart of Louisiana, and Inside New Orleans, as well as at the Louisiana State Archives. She is retired communications coordinator for Louisiana Sea Grant. Mary is the author of a nonfiction trilogy based on the cases she handled as a forensic anthropologist. Those books include The Bone Lady, Trail of Bones, and Bone Remains. She also has published the murder mystery novel Floating Souls, The Canal Murders. She is retired director of the LSU Faces Laboratory, where for more than 30 years she assisted law enforcement agencies locally, regionally, and nationally. She also consulted on hundreds of forensic cases as director of the Louisiana Repository for Unidentified and Missing Persons Information Program. Our other speaker, third speaker, is Peter Diedick. He is the author of The Cemeteries of New Orleans, A Cultural History. He will be talking about the history and design of the Crescent City's famed cemeteries, where they are located and why, the tomb styles, the architecture of the monuments, the cultural and tourism practice surrounding them, and preservation concerns. Peter is also the author of the book Hip to the Trip, A Cultural History of Route 66. He is associate professor in the Department of History at Texas State University and authored the textbook Historic Preservation for Designers. He used to live full-time in New Orleans, so he's steeped in that city's history. Welcome, Mark.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. What a beautiful day after last night, right? I am Mary Manhein, and for more than 36 years I've been digging up the dead all over this state and quite a few others. Today, the way we're going to handle this is as a panel group. Both Jessica and I are going to speak together for about 15 minutes or so, and then Peter's going to speak for about 15 minutes. And then we would welcome questions from the floor, because that's my idea of a panel. So if you have questions, you could just hold them till the end. We will try to answer everyone that you have. But over the years, I've thought a lot, of course, about cemeteries. When I was a little girl, we used to go to what we call the grave cleaning. I imagine some of you may have done that if you're from rural Louisiana or Arkansas. This was in South Arkansas, Southwest Arkansas, and Northwest Louisiana. And we would go to the graves where our family, our friends were buried, and they were our ancestors. A lot of them were from very ancient times. Well, I went up there a few years ago to the old State Line Cemetery in North Louisiana, and the area where I distinctly remembered my relatives were buried was no longer there. It had been covered over by a highway. And that really got me to thinking a lot about how so much of our culture is lost just to urban renewal, eminent domain, subsidence, all kinds of things that we address in our book. But I've excavated forensic cases and archaeological burials all across Louisiana, from ancient Native Americans, quite a few thousand years old, 5,000 to 6,000 years old. What we say Indians, where I come from, because my great-grandmother was Alabama Choctaw, and so we call ourselves Indians. But thousands of years old, those cases to Civil War soldiers that we worked on in the 80s and early 90s. And Port Hudson is one of those areas where we worked, where we found soldiers, both Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers buried side by side. How did we know? It wasn't from the bones, it was from the buttons they left behind, the buttons of their uniforms. So they were buried side by side, which I think is a very important lesson for us to learn about the past. The acidic soil in the area prevented any type of preservation of them. So I've always been fascinated with graves. Port Hudson, as I said, Cowpens Slough, New Orleans. I have excavated hundreds, maybe even thousands of burials from New Orleans, victims of disease, of war. One cemetery that you may be familiar with that I just want to touch on that's in our book is the St. Peter Street Cemetery. Some of you are familiar with that. St. Louis 1 is not the oldest formal cemetery in New Orleans. It's St. Peter Street. Is anyone familiar? Some of you are probably familiar with St. Peter Street. Of course you are. You don't count. But St. Peter Street dates from the early 1700s. We're talking about the 1720s. And then it was deconsecrated in the late 1700s because it was too full. And for those of you who do not know where it is currently bound by the streets of St. Peter, North Rampart, Envision, the French Quarter, if you would, Toulouse, and Burgundy, as we say in South Louisiana. And it's still there today. When we think of burials in South Louisiana, we think of the above-the-ground burial vaults. That's a whole story in and of itself. But all of the burials, thousands of burials in St. Peter Street Cemetery were below ground. And so a few years ago, there's a story in the book about that a few years ago, there was a man who owns property in that area. He has a beautiful condominium there, and he wanted to place a swimming pool in his backyard. And I knew from the work that I've done there in that very block that what was he going to hit. I tried my best to talk him into placing an above-the-ground pool, but no, he wanted a below-the-ground pool. I've seen Poltergeist. I know what they did in that movie. I have a very strong appreciation for anything like that. And so, of course, they hit burials as they began to dig the foundation for this swimming pool, and we were asked to recover some of them, and we did, and we analyzed them at LSU, and then they have been reburied since then. But there's all kinds of things you're going to run into, and one of the reasons they deconsecrated that graveyard was not only was it because it was very full, but we all know that the French Quarter is one of the highest places in New Orleans. So by 1805, all of that land in that square block had been sold. So much of what we do when we do these recovery of burials is what we call salvage archaeology, as I mentioned earlier. And this brings me to our current work. Jessica will tell you a little bit about the background and how we were able to capture a little of the past that cannot be preserved because for so many reasons. But when those cemeteries are lost, our culture is lost. Just like the cemetery of my forefathers up in North Louisiana. It's gone forever. Nobody really recorded it. And so this information that we have in our book, and which others will have also, will preserve for future generations when everything else falls away. Thank you, Jessica.
My work in this book started out as a paper in Mary's class. I was a student, and we were assigned a paper to write, and I chose to write my paper on cemeteries and eminent domain, just like Mary was speaking about her family cemetery being covered over. I'm also very interested in cemeteries from a very young age. We have a family cemetery in East Texas, and while it still exists, it's how I fell in love with cemeteries. Even from a really young child, my cousins and I, we'd walk down from our grandmother's house and go to our family cemetery and look at the names on the headstones and the dates. And I wanted to know not just more about the graveyard itself, but the people behind the names on the headstones. And that's always had an interest in my background. But our book, Fragile Grounds, is the culmination of 5 years of documenting cemeteries. After I wrote this paper in Mary's class, the wheels got to spinning in my head, and I also, at the time, worked for Louisiana Sea Grant as a communications coordinator, and I had a strong knowledge of our coastal communities and what's happening as our coastline erodes and storms come in. We're inundated with water, the land is receding, erosion's happening, subsidence, which is the sinking of the land. And I put the 2 and 2 together. We have all these cemeteries and we have an eroding coast. So what's happening to the cemeteries? Well, the hard reality is that these cemeteries will go to the Gulf of Mexico as the water inundates the land and the land is eroded. So again, this book culminates 5 years of us traveling across 20 coastal parishes and 4 inland parishes, documenting endangered cemeteries. We documented 138 cemeteries by GPS locating them, and I took more than 11,000 photos. I stopped counting at that point. The book details 44 of these endangered sites. It's vignettes and photographs. And one of the things that we found as we went through this project is people wanted to tell us their stories. They wanted us to document their history that's being lost. So these stories are what Fragile Grounds is based on. So not only the geography and the physical structure of what we're losing, but also the cultural history. And one of the things that I like to say is, as we traveled across our coast from west to east, you can really see the immigration pattern of how our state was settled when you look at the names on the headstones. And as our land is going, we are losing the cultural fabric of our state. It's like the bottom of our state is a tapestry, and as the land goes, we're losing that. So we also, in the beginning of the book, in a small way, talk about the burial customs and traditions of our state, and that's where Peter's work is going to tie in, and I'm going to let him take it from there.
Hello, and good afternoon. My name is Peter Diedick, so I've already been introduced. I'll introduce myself again, and the name of my book is Cemeteries of New Orleans, A Cultural History. In this talk, I will touch on 4 points. The first is what led me to write this book. The second is how and why the cemeteries of New Orleans developed differently from the cemeteries in the rest of the United States. The third is how the cemeteries are not just places to bury people, but are, and always have been, a major aspect of the life and the history of the city of New Orleans. Fourth, I will discuss some of the reasons why it is so important that these special places be preserved. The historic cities of the dead that can be found throughout New Orleans are unique and striking. I grew up knowing the northeastern churchyards and garden cemeteries of upstate New York and New England, which are hallowed grounds where most people are buried in underground graves marked by individual headstones. Burial in a family tomb was reserved only for the very rich. Grass and trees surrounded everything. When I first visited the 1789 St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the oldest existing cemetery in New Orleans, after moving here in 1991, I was shocked by its narrow streets lined with densely packed tombs. I didn't know what to make of its rows of brick oven tombs, especially after a gentleman who was hanging around the cemetery chatting with tourists told me that those interred there usually ended up sharing their last resting place with others, often many times over. This completely upended my Yankee notion that everyone gets an exclusive place of real estate where they are allowed to decay in peace for eternity. Why, I wondered, did the people of this city bury their dead in such a way? And how long had they been doing this? Were these cemeteries French, I asked? If this weren't strange enough, I then noticed that the fronts of a few of the old tombs were draped with offerings of coins, alcohol, lipstick, and other seemingly random items. Half-burned candles and strange X's could also be seen there. After doing some research, I learned that New Orleans has a high water table, which made burial above ground necessary. That this type of interment had been practiced for centuries here, and that the offerings on the tombs I saw had been made by practitioners of voodoo or by tourists. I was satisfied with these explanations. However, years later, while visiting a remote hilltop cemetery in southern Spain, I walked through a gate into an old cemetery and thought that except for the mountain views, this place looked like a New Orleans cemetery. How could this be, I wondered? They certainly had no issues with high water tables here in the mountains of Spain. This led to more questions. What in its history and culture made cemeteries in New Orleans look more like cemeteries in Andalusia or Madrid than ones in Atlanta or even in North Louisiana? When were the tombs first constructed? Who designed and built them? And finally, why did some of the larger tombs bear the names of fraternal or ethnic associations? The Cemeteries of New Orleans, A Cultural History, tackles these questions and more. Unlike most books about historic cemeteries, it does not focus on the famous people buried in them, but rather on those who designed, built, visited, mourned, and worked there. The book examines the role of the cemeteries in the context of the many cultures that have created and sustained the city's climate, its geography, and a fascinating history from its founding in 1718 until around the 1920s. With their strange appearance, the city's historic cemeteries have long caught the attention of visitors and residents alike. They make such an impression partly because their history goes all the way back to ancient Rome and the Middle Ages. Ancient Romans buried many of their dead above ground in tombs that often look strikingly similar to the tombs one finds in the older cemeteries today. This is because the French and Spanish modified ancient Greek, Roman, and medieval burial traditions and brought them to the banks of the Mississippi centuries ago. In the 1830s, New Orleans' relatively simple traditional cemetery architecture began to become more varied, fashionable, and intricate as revivalist architectural styles, particularly those brought from Europe by French architect J.N.B. Dupuy, transformed the formerly boxy brick and stucco tombs into sophisticated architectural expressions, resembling miniature Greco-Roman temples or medieval chapels, often finished in cut marble. As the cemeteries developed, craftspeople and designers from various parts of America and Europe came to the city to design and construct distinctive tombs and grave markers. Their contributions added to the architectural and artistic qualities of the cemeteries that we can still see today. Although most early New Orleans tomb builders, such as P.H. Monsoreau and Newton Richards, came from elsewhere, a number were native to the city. Two such craftspeople were Eugene and Daniel Warburg, brothers who worked in the marble cutting business in the second half of the 1800s. The Warburgs were free people of color, known at the time as Black Creoles, who constructed tombs for the city's French-speaking population, mainly in St. Louis No. 1, St. Louis No. 2, and St. Louis No. 3 cemeteries. Their father was Daniel Samuel Warburg, a member of a prosperous Jewish family who had immigrated from Hamburg, Germany in 1821. Soon after arriving in New Orleans, Warburg purchased Marie Rose Blondeau, an enslaved woman of mixed race who had been born in Cuba, and pursued a relationship with her. In 1826, she gave birth to a son, Eugene, who was born into slavery. Warburg freed Eugene when he was 4 years old, and his brother Daniel came to the world as a free person of color in 1836. The elder Warburg was a land speculator who made a fortune buying, selling, and developing Louisiana real estate in the 1830s. The father decided to have his sons trained in the trade of marble cutting and sculpting funerary art. Although their formal education was cut short by Warburg's financial problems in the late 1830s, both Eugene and Daniel were literate, and Eugene was reported to have written French well. Eugene studied sculpture with Philippe Gabriel, a Frenchman who had been schooled in Paris and was reputed to be the best sculptor in New Orleans at the time. Although he focused his ambitions on high art, Eugene also did cemetery work, decorating tombs and carving marble funerary sculpture to support himself. Although Daniel would practice the cemetery stone cutting art for the rest of his life, Eugene left for France to pursue a career as a fine sculptor. In Paris, Eugene met John Young Mason, the United States Minister of France, who commissioned him to create a classical bust of himself. After this, he traveled to England, where he met the Duchess of Sutherland, a philanthropist and abolitionist, who commissioned him to do a series of reliefs depicting scenes from Uncle Tom's Cabin. After returning to France and spending 4 years in that country as an art student and artist, he set out for Italy in 1857. Unfortunately, Eugene was never able to reach the artistic heights that his talents warranted. He died in Rome of sickness in 1859, at just 33 years old. His younger brother Daniel outlived him and continued to work in marble at his studio on St. Louis and Basin Street in New Orleans until the early 1900s. Many of Eugene and Daniel Warburg's creations can still be found in the older cemeteries today, and Daniel's son, Daniel Warburg Jr., also built tombs well into the 20th century. The cemeteries of New Orleans are not solely places where one finds interesting architecture. In these walled sanctuaries, life and death have intersected for nearly 3 centuries. This included an annual holiday, which the people of New Orleans have celebrated in the cemetery since the 1700s. All Saints' Days observations brought people from all walks of life together to share a common respect for the dead and reverence for the cemeteries in a surprisingly celebratory atmosphere. Each November 1st, thousands of people would fill every cemetery in the city. The holiday required a great deal of effort and expense. For weeks beforehand, writes a traveler in 1851, the preparations are in progress. Servants pass at all hours of the day, laden with baskets from which bouquets and garlands of paper muslin or wax flower pots containing living flowers and tapers and silver candlesticks, richly trimmed with cut paper, peep forth. In 1847, J.D.B. Duval, the editor of the Commercial Review of the South and West, described All Saints' Day in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2, quote, "Strains of music float over the tombs, and amidst them and around them solemn marches of priests chant at all nightfall their requiems and mutter their prayers for the souls of the dead. All day long, thousands and 10,000s have been visiting the habitations of the dead. Gorgeous ornaments are here for gorgeous tombs, candlesticks and crucifixes of gold and silver, rich vases and costly odors," unquote. Despite the inherently solemn nature of the occasion, it truly was celebrated with a kind of joy. Duval continues, "The last traces of the daylight are lingering faintly on the scene. The waxen candles are lit up. Throngs of visitors are growing gayer. Music is wafting its lively notes. The laugh of merriment and the noise of cannon are heard," unquote. And finally, a newspaper reporter observed at All Saints' Day in 1905, quote, "The majority of visitors who throng the cemeteries do not strike a stranger as mourners. They go cheerful, bedecked in their best bib and tuckers, and the conversation that floats from the various groups seems to bear out the earlier significance of the day, that the dead have returned." And just make a note that yesterday I was in one of the cemeteries, and there was a jazz funeral, and I thought of those quotes when I saw it, because as those who know about jazz funerals, they start out with very somber music with funerals ending, and they were playing "I'll Fly Away" with this beautiful, cheerful manner, and the notes were like echoing among the tombs. It was just beautiful. It was at St. Roch Cemetery, actually. It was just amazing. So the spirit lives on even today. As an integral part of the life of the city, the cemeteries also drew practitioners of the shadowy and often misunderstood religion of voodoo, who used them as places of worship and as foci of memory, power, and magic. For example, a local newspaper reported in 1931 that relatives of a woman buried in St. Roch Cemetery found a black candle in a mound of excavated dirt on her grave. Digging with their fingers, they found a tin can containing the photograph of a man, a pack of needles, and tobacco inside. A 1938 article in the Times-Picayune relates, quote, "On St. John's Eve, the most important night on the voodoo calendar, Negroes visit Marie Laveau's tomb. They leave pennies in the dirt nearby and mark with red brick crosses on the tomb. They whisper their desires to Marie Laveau, and some say they are answered," unquote. For quite some time, people have been making X's on Marie Laveau's tomb and on other sepulchres believed to be inhabited by deceased voodoo priests and priestesses. One such tomb is an oven vault in St. Louis number 2, known as the Wishing Vault. In 1921, the Times-Picayune devoted an article to this tomb. The newspaper quoted the cemetery sexton as saying, "They come slipping through the gate and looking around so carefully to see that no one is watching. They go down an aisle, you see, and before every tomb they pause and tap 3 times with the tips of the fingers while they whisper the wish that they want to come true. Then they come to the voodoo tomb at the end of the aisle, and with a piece of shell from the walk, they make a cross on the bricks and repeat the wish out loud. See all the scratches they have made." The same sexton also reported that people had left charms at the tomb, such as a rabbit's foot, a small onion pierced by a goose feather, bits of hair with pepper or salt, or large thorns stuck to each other to form strange designs. To a greater degree than in most other places in the city, the cemeteries have provided and continue to provide a point of contact between the past and the present, the living and the dead. They have hosted colorful parades and elaborate ceremonies. They have been venues of charity, community building, and social one-upmanship. Historic cemeteries can be found in nearly every neighborhood as quiet neighbors to many who live in the city. They reflect New Orleans history and chronicle its triumphs and tragedies in brick, marble, granite, and iron. Despite their historical significance, the care of the tombs has been consistent, with some being meticulously maintained and others left shamefully neglected throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The family or organization owning a tomb has always been responsible for its maintenance, and the reasons a family might neglect a tomb are numerous. Some families have died out, while the descendants of others may have moved away or lost the economic resources that allowed their ancestors to build the family tomb in the first place. In some cases, entire cemeteries or sections of cemeteries were demolished. In 1822, shockingly early in its history, the Protestant section of St. Louis number 1 was partially demolished to make way for road construction, the great nemesis of historic architecture the world over. In the following decades, large swaths of historic tombs, the supposedly sacred resting places of people's ancestors, were razed. In 1839, the Daily Picayune reported that upon visiting St. Louis number 1, one of its reporters was dismayed to see that sections of the cemetery's walls had been taken down and stakes for a new road had been planted through the cemetery itself. So much of the cemetery eventually fell to road construction and was paved over that the pyramidal Barney tomb, which is now close to the cemetery's entrance, was once near the cemetery's center. In the 20th century, the entire Protestant Girard Street Cemetery and the gates of Mercy Cemetery, the first Jewish burial ground in the city, founded in 1828, were completely demolished. The loss of these historic cemeteries prompted preservation efforts. St. Louis number 1 and St. Louis number 2 are listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1975. Oddfellows Rest was added in 1980, and the Metairie Cemetery in 1991. Despite the survival of most of the cemeteries, many tombs and monuments, particularly those in the lesser-known grounds, such as Lafayette number 2, suffer from neglect and vandalism and are in danger of being lost forever. Because of the poor condition of many of the city's cemeteries, New Orleans preservationist Mary Louise Christovich spearheaded the creation of Save Our Cemeteries in 1974. Save Our Cemeteries developed a broad vision, as is indicated in its mission statement. Quote, "Save Our Cemeteries is dedicated to the preservation, promotion, and protection of New Orleans historic cemeteries through restoration, education, and advocacy." In addition to the valuable work of Save Our Cemeteries, securing a long-term future for the cemeteries can be achieved through implementing a number of preservation measures, such as encouraging and incentivizing families to restore the tombs of their ancestors, creating nonprofit advocacy groups for the preservation and active restoration of specific individual cemeteries, expanding the city's municipal cemetery office and providing funding and adding preservation specialists on staff to restore and oversee the restoration of tombs. Also, passing a city ordinance enforcing a set of restoration guidelines to protect tombs and monuments from damaging repairs and destructive alterations. And finally, efforts to better guide and control tourism so that neither endangers the cemeteries by leaving them vulnerable to vandalism or turns them into overly regulated history theme parks. If the people of New Orleans choose to actively preserve their cemeteries through these and other measures, these amazing historic places will survive to enchant future generations. It is my hope that my book inspires people to appreciate and to preserve these amazing historic places. Thank you.
Okay, we're ready for some questions now. That was very interesting, Peter. Thank you. How about some questions? Don't you do this. We say 15 minutes for you guys. Anybody? Questions? Don't you want to know? Okay. Hey, girl. Okay, you want to get this LaFort, right? Okay, you can handle that.
LaFort Cemetery is in Leeville, which is an area that used to be called Missville in Orange City. That one is very near another one called Leeville Lafont, and those cannot be saved at this point. They will eventually go to the Gulf of Mexico. And there's other cemeteries in our book that are in that same predicament. Another one is Ile de Champ-Charles, which is in Terrebonne Parish. That one is an Indian burial site which has 50 known graves, but maybe 200 unrecorded graves that are recorded from the oral history of the Indians that lived there. That tribe has been in a process of moving inland, and that burial site will also be left to surrender to the Gulf.
Still? Yes, very much so. I was just at their soiree at St. Louis No. 3 on Thursday night, so yes, they appear to be recently becoming more active.
It's actually saveourcemeteries.org if you want to look it up. And I might
add that until 1990, there really was no law that protected these cemeteries. But in 1990, I had the opportunity to help write legislation that was passed. And so there is the unmarked burials law in Louisiana now that helps to protect many of these graves. And so they're very active, and through the Attorney General's office, they have a whole group who work with people when human remains are found that are not forensic in nature. In Louisiana, remains are forensic in nature if it's been 50 years or fewer since the person died. Well, I know that through the Division of Archaeology, they have begun to record a lot of I think there's federal grants maybe involved too, where they've begun to record a lot of these cemeteries. So I think it would be a good idea if you got in touch with the Division of Archaeology to see the information that they have. I don't know what they have for that particular parish, but I understand that they're actually doing a survey that's similar to what we have done in the past.
Yeah, it's in the garden. Yeah, well, in the garden.
Not going back. Didn't I see some questions over here?
It's in our book. The cemetery is named East. It's spelled I-S-T-R-E. And there are 3 historical grave houses in that cemetery and 1 current. It's a modern grave house that was built for a child. But no one knows the origin of those grave houses. But we do tell the little bit that we know is detailed in our book.
I do know that grave houses are also, they can be found in Texas as well, and in North Louisiana.
They're unusual though, and basically what it amounts to is that you have a burial, sometimes a little vault inside of the little wooden house, and it has windows and all that. They're quite fascinating, very rare in Louisiana.
There's more graves. I think it was this fall when this year they were cast iron caskets and they were brought back to the Mason's lab and they examined every code and stuff of those. Is that cemetery also in the book? Or is it just one of the ones? I don't remember the name of the cemetery. It's along the Mississippi River.
Along the Mississippi River. I honestly don't know which one you're talking about. We have opened quite a few cast iron coffins, but there was one on the Mississippi River, and that one was reburied, but that was not cast iron. So the cast iron coffins that we have worked on in the Faces Lab were not floating into the river that I can recall.
The lecture I attended was on the computer.
Oh, you're thinking about one that out of Thibodeau, I believe. That's the one, St. Joseph Cemetery. Right. It wasn't right, but yes, it's fascinating. And that's the one she's talking about, just very quickly, is one where we were able to determine from the clothing, and the preservation was phenomenal. It was as though that person's clothing had just been placed in that cast iron coffin, maybe 2 or 3 years prior to that. It was 150 years old. So the preservation of these old cast iron coffins, if they don't get a leak in them, is amazing. We've had them where they've even had plants that have been preserved, the roses, the ferns, all kinds of different things. So we learned so much from the past looking at these. And mainly, as I've noted earlier, salvage archaeology. It's not always that we're going to go in there and just take this, select this, and take it out and look at it. That's not the way it works. More often than not, it's salvage archaeology, where urban renewal or road being created, being made, something causes us to have to go in and look at things. That's a very good point. Preservation can be phenomenal. Or it can be like the soldiers, the Civil War soldiers from 1863, where they only had bone meal left and had their buttons diagonally and straight up, just amazing.
One more thing that I wanted to say about our book, Fragile Grounds, is that it's not about saving these burial sites. It's about documenting them before they're gone in Louisiana.
Oh, yes, yes. You can join Save Our Cemetery. That's her question. Absolutely.
Are y'all aware of any federal or state grants that help to do preservation in these old cemeteries? One that we're interested in St. Mary's, in White Castle, Bayou area. They're very, very small, but it dates back somewhere around the 1860s, 50s.
Again, I might check with the Division of Archaeology, but also humanities. And not recalling.
Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities.
Yeah, sometimes there are grants for various things, whether or not they had any for cemeteries. I know so many people, everywhere I go, people say to me, we have a cemetery here, it's a family cemetery, and you want to help them so much, you want to be able to do it. And we've done a lot of that, many more than you will see in the book.
The government grants are very hard to come by for a lot of preservation projects, particularly cemeteries. So probably a better approach really would be to work at the local level and fundraise and also get people to volunteer their time. And then you can also work with the State Historic Preservation Office. They have guidelines on how to restore tombs, and they are probably would be willing to send somebody out to give you some direct help and kind of advice about how to save the particular resources. But that's what I recommend.
GPS coordinates, these are the grave site data.
We didn't include the coordinates in the book because there's tens of thousands of them in our work, but eventually this will go as a historical record for the state. Just the project's not completely finished yet, but it will be available to the state of Louisiana a little bit down the road. Right now, they are using some of our data for cleanup in hurricane instances, like the Louisiana Department of Health just asked for our data to help in Harvey storm recovery. We also gave it to Livingston Parish for the flood of 2016 recovery. It's been used in St. Bernard and Plaquemines for other storm recovery efforts.
Are you saying that you are making GPS coordinates?
Yes.
Right, all the perimeter of the cemetery, we go around it. There are data out there for many of these cemeteries, but they're one-point data. And what we're doing is walking the entire cemetery where we can tell the guidelines are, and so we are actually doing the shape of the
Yes.
cemetery.
If you have one point, one single GPS point to mark a cemetery and the land as you wrote it or inundated, you don't know what you've lost. So what we did was we created polygons. So the polygon data will always be there even when the land's gone.
The traditional burial depth was 6 feet. Why was it 6 feet?
The original burial depth was 6 feet. You say, why was it 6 feet?
Correct. Why not 5?
Well, actually, if you want to know the truth, very few burials in this state are 6 feet down, I can tell you. They range anywhere between about 3 feet, maybe to 4. Occasionally, they are that deep. Why they are specifically 6 feet deep, I don't know.
Many of the burials in New Orleans are 6 feet up, actually.
Yes.
It was originally, I'm not exactly sure why they picked 6 feet, but in the late 1700s, there was a movement in Europe to sanitize graveyards. It picked up a lot of steam in the early 1800s because they believed during the 1800s, 17 and 1800s, that disease was spread through cemeteries, and this gas called miasma would come up from the dead bodies and kill people, that cause yellow fever and cholera and other diseases like that. So there were a number of reformers who recommended burying people deep in the ground for the reasons that it would protect the living. That's the actual reason, but it was very rarely practiced, and particularly in a place like South Louisiana with the water table, it's not, that wasn't very realistic.
And there were others who say that it was because it was the height of the shovels at the time. They have very tall shovels, and so the shovel perhaps was 6 feet tall. I mean, who knows? Thank you. Thank you all very much.